So for those of you who crave to-do lists, this sermon series is for you. I designed this perfectly for you because what God gives us in the 10 Commandments is a checklist on how to be perfect, which is the title of this sermon series, How to Be Perfect. If you are longing for perfection, which you are, I am, we all are. We all know that we're imperfect, but we all long for perfection, whether you realize it or not. If you are longing to be perfect, God does us a huge favor. He just gives us 10 simple steps. Clear, straightforward. Here's your checklist. If you want to be perfect, and since God only accepts perfection, then this is pretty important that we get this. If God only loves perfection, then it's pretty important that we get this. If favor with God and acceptance with God and approval from God is ultimately based on perfection, then this is pretty important. So this is for you, it's for me. God does us a huge favor by giving us a checklist on how to be perfect in just 10 simple steps. Now, we laugh, of course, but this is the way we typically treat the 10 Commandments. Like it's a divine self-help manual. Like God is doing us a favor by giving us these 10 steps. He has required, demanded perfection, perfect righteousness, infallible righteousness in order for us to receive His love and affection and approval and those sorts of things. And so God has given us this checklist, and if we can simply succeed in checking off the boxes, then we can guarantee that God will love us forever. Okay, that's typically the way that we view the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, let me say, come from God, which means they are good. They show us what God is like, what He requires of us, how life works best. The problem we face isn't that the 10 Commandments aren't good. The problem we face is that the 10 Commandments are too good. They're too good for bad people like you and me. That's really the problem. The problem is not, as Paul says in Romans 7, the problem is not the law. That's not the problem. That comes from God. It's perfect. God does all things perfectly, even in the giving of His law. This is God speaking. This is God showing us who He is, how holy, how above He is, how transcendent He is, how infallible He is, how perfect He is. This is showing God's righteous standards, and anytime God shows Himself, it's good. So the problem is not the commandments, the problem is us. You see, if we take the 10 Commandments seriously, very seriously, not like half seriously, like here's a checklist from God, and if you just try hard and do your best, God will see that you're trying hard and doing your best, even though you're falling short, and He'll sweep your imperfections under the rug. Okay, just do your best, and God will do the rest, because after all, God is your co-pilot. He's there to help you achieve your best life now if you just follow these 10 simple steps, okay? That's not taking the 10 Commandments seriously. If we take the 10 Commandments seriously, what they do is destroy our ability to think of ourselves as good. They crush us. Because if we really look at them and take them seriously, take God at His word, I mean, I don't know about you, but I felt somewhat queasy and uncomfortable just reading them. Because I know what goes on inside of me. I know the things that I think and say and do, and the things that I fail to think and say and do, and I compare my failings with God's perfect standard, and I'm acutely aware of the fact that I have fallen woefully short. It's uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable. Anytime God shows us His perfect standard, anytime God shows His perfect standard to imperfect people, the imperfect people should feel somewhat uncomfortable, shifty in their seats. And so when we realize through the commandments that we're not perfect, we're devastated. You see, the 10 Commandments are not a primer on how to be good. They're a primer on how to be perfect. Big difference. Okay, they're not a checklist on how to be good. And it's not a checklist that shows what good people do. This is a primer on how to be perfect. And when we realize through the commandments that we're not perfect, we're devastated. But as we are going to see, there is a gracious answer to that devastation. A wonderfully gracious answer to that devastation. So each week we're going to look at one of the commandments. But to introduce this series, we're going to skip ahead to Matthew chapter 5 because it's in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gives his authoritative interpretation of the Ten Commandments. And if we are going to understand the Ten Commandments the way God intends for us to understand the Ten Commandments, it's probably wise to skip ahead to Matthew chapter 5 and learn from Jesus. Jesus taught how to understand and interpret the Ten Commandments, how to understand and interpret God's law. And so, lest we get off course right at the start by trying to interpret this on our own, let's go to Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 and ask him, what do we do with God's law? What do we do with the Ten Commandments? How are we supposed to understand them? How are we supposed to interpret them? This is Matthew chapter 5, Jesus' authoritative, godly interpretation of the Ten Commandments. And to prove this to you, to show that this is in fact what Jesus is doing, I need to show you how Matthew is clearly indicating that Jesus is, in a sense, reenacting and reliving Israel's history. Okay, so think back in your minds to the Old Testament. I mean, we just read in Exodus that God announces in verse 1 of chapter 20, I'm the Lord your God. I've rescued you out of the land of Egypt. I've rescued you from slavery to the Egyptians. He shows how he has, in a one-way love manner, rescued his people and is moving them to the promised land. And it's on their way that God gives them his law, the children of Israel, his law. So God's children were in Israel, and a ruler orders the slaughter of babies. Remember this? Pharaoh with Moses, okay? Pharaoh is desperately trying to trying to basically shrink the population of the Israelites that were growing up underneath his nose. And so he starts by trying to, kill the babies because he's afraid that in due time, the Israelites will outnumber the Egyptians and they'll take over. So God's children were in Israel. A ruler orders the slaughter of babies, Pharaoh with Moses. God called them out of Egypt. They passed through the waters of the Red Sea. They were organized according to 12 tribes. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And during that time, Moses ascended the mountain, Sinai, to receive and deliver God's law. That is the Cliff Notes version, okay? Now, fast forward to Jesus. How does that history parallel Jesus' history? Well, Matthew's telling of the gospel tells us that God's child is in Egypt, because a ruler ordered the slaughter of babies. Remember, King Herod was afraid when he heard that there was a king that was born, and he didn't understand who this king was, but he too, like Pharaoh, was afraid that he would be overpowered and overturned, and so he orders the killing of babies. And Jesus and his family are called out of Egypt. Jesus passes through the waters of baptism. He spends 40 days and nights in the wilderness. He calls 12 disciples, and in our verses, he ascends a mountain and begins to teach. This is not accidental, okay? This is intentional. I mean, there is a direct parallel here. And so what that means is that this section of Matthew clearly parallels that part of Israel's history where they received the Ten Commandments. In other words, this whole sermon that Jesus is getting ready to preach in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is about God's law. Victor, are you listening to music again while I'm preaching? I mean, jeez, Jesus loves you anyway. But I'm having a hard time loving you right now. It's the what? I know. I'll help. Zach, will you help Victor? Or maybe you and I could. Good. Thanks, Zach. Let's give it up for Zach. He's more than just a musician. He's a pastor to technologically challenged people. You know how much we love you, Victor. I thought God was speaking to me, actually. I was like, sounded like Morgan Freeman's voice. I'm not sure if God sounds more like Morgan Freeman or Steve Brown. It's probably a combination of both. But if I do get to heaven and God's voice does not sound like Steve Brown's, I'm going to be disappointed. I got to be honest. So this section, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, is intentionally paralleled to the giving of the law back in Exodus. This is Jesus reenacting, in a sense, and reliving Israel's history to show that what he's doing here in these verses in Matthew chapter 5 is an authoritative interpretation of the law that the Israelites received way back in the day. So Jesus preached. Now this is interesting, okay? And I saw this yesterday for the first time. Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount to those who thought they were keeping the Ten Commandments. Okay, now that's important for us, because if we treat the Ten Commandments like they are a moralistic checklist that will promise us a good life if we just do more, try harder, and get better, then we will fail to understand the primary purpose of God's law. And the people that Jesus was getting ready to preach to, they failed to understand the primary purpose of God's law. And so Jesus preached this sermon to those who thought they were keeping the Ten Commandments. He wanted to show them that they weren't keeping the Ten Commandments. He wanted to show just how deep and wide and pervasive God's law reaches, that just because they were seemingly doing okay on the outside, God's law is deeper than that. God's law requires more than that. And so Jesus preached this sermon to those who thought they were keeping the Ten Commandments. Now, it's important to note that Jesus here is not giving a new law. He's not giving a new law. He is, as I mentioned, providing an authoritative interpretation of God's law, and he shows that God's law is far more intense than we realize. Because some of us could read through the Ten Commandments, and in a delusional way, if we just read through the Ten Commandments, in a delusional way, we might be able to say, okay, we haven't kept all 10 of them perfectly, but we've kept like 8 of them perfectly. I mean, there's things we haven't done that the Ten Commandments lists. Well, then you skip over to Matthew chapter 5 and you realize I've kept none of them. And I can't keep any of them to the degree that God requires and to the degree that God demands. You see, the way we typically define righteousness has to do almost exclusively with what a person does or does not do. It's the way we define it. So a righteous person is one who does the right things and avoids the wrong things. An unrighteous person is one who does the wrong things and avoids the right things. Virtue and uprightness is purely a matter of outer conduct without any hint of what's actually going on inside of us. That's the way we typically define righteousness. This is the way the world defines righteousness. This comes from an amazing book called Living by Grace by a now deceased theologian and seminary president by the name of William Hordern, who you've never heard of, but go on Amazon, Living by Grace, William Hordern, amazing book. This is the way the world, he tells in that book the way the world defines righteousness. The law enforcement institutions of society are concerned with right behavior. They do not care why people obey the law, so long as they obey it. The person who breaks no laws is righteous in their sight, regardless of the motivation that produces law-abiding behavior. Now that's not just the law enforcement institutions. That's the way we think about one another. That's the way we think as parents. That's the way we think about people. That if they are doing the right thing on the outside, that is righteous. And if they're doing the wrong thing on the outside, that is unrighteousness. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus breaks radically from this superficial definition of righteousness. He cuts through the outer behavior of a person and looks at what's in the heart. And what Jesus does here is he insists that righteousness is not simply a matter of what we do or don't do, but rather a question of why we do or don't do it. Now this is where God's law becomes crushing. Because when Jesus begins to press the issue and show that keeping God's law, keeping God's requirements, satisfying God's demands are much bigger than simply doing the right thing on the outside. You have to want to do the right thing on the inside without interruption and without imperfection. When he does that, he levels the playing field. Very much like Paul in Romans 1, 2, and 3. Levels the playing field. There is no us and them. There are no law keepers and law breakers. There are not two groups of people. This group over here is keeping God's law, and this group over here is not keeping God's law. The Bible makes it very clear there is no us and them. There's us and him. That's the only distinction that the Bible gives us. And Jesus makes this point and presses this home in this sermon. You see, the biblical view of righteousness is not a behavioristic view that looks simply at the outward action. It always looks within to the motivation of the act. And once that becomes the rules of the game, we all fail. Once we get beyond the outward appearance and the outward action and we start looking inside to what's actually motivating the act, we all find ourselves guilty because the reason this is so important is because many Christians think that they're pulling it off when they obey even when they don't want to. Okay, now I'm going to unpack this for a minute because this is really, really important. Most Christian institutions, church, school, home, whatever, most Christian institutions press this idea that you're pulling it off. You're actually doing something righteous if you do something good, even if you don't want to do it. Now, listen, let me start with this. Where did we get the idea that if we do what God tells us to do, even though our hearts are far from him, that it's something to be proud of, something admirable, something praiseworthy, something righteous? Now listen, don't get me wrong, okay? We should obey even when we don't feel like it. Okay, I expect that out of my children. I expect that out of myself. We should obey even when we don't feel like it. I'm not saying, just if you don't feel it, don't do it, okay? I mean, our feelings are bad most of the time, all of the time at some level. And so if we just do what we feel like doing, it's going to be destructive to both us and the people around us. So I'm not saying that we should obey only when we feel like it. But listen, let's not make the common mistake of proudly equating that with the righteousness that God requires. You understand there's a difference there. I'm saying, okay, you don't feel it. Here's a good thing, here's a bad thing. You're not feeling like doing the good thing, you're feeling like doing the bad thing. Just do the good thing. Whether you feel like it or not, do the good thing. But it's a huge mistake to equate doing the good thing even when you don't feel like it with the righteousness that God requires. You see, this is... Doing the right thing with the wrong heart reveals deep unrighteousness, not devout righteousness. So when we do the right thing, even though we don't feel like doing the right thing, in a sense, we're avoiding the bad thing, we're going toward the good thing, even though we don't feel like going toward the good thing. But what that reveals is how far our hearts are from what God requires, and that reveals deep unrighteousness, not devout righteousness. I'll give you an example. Friday, real humdinger for me. I'm pulling in if you were there, you saw it. Many people saw it. I'm getting ready to meet Steve Saliba to go work out, and I turn off of Federal Highway onto 56. This is 56, right? 56th. And every kid at Westminster Academy, seemingly, was waiting to cross the street to go to lunch. Every kid in school. It's like 1,000 kids saying right there. Felt like it anyway. And so I'm getting ready to pull in, okay, to where I park my car over here. So you get the picture, okay? I'm 56, Westminster's here, Coral Ridge is here. I'm getting ready to pull in. All the kids are waiting over here to cross to go over here, okay? That's the scene. Picture the scene. Well, some dude is flying flying, okay, in his car. Now, I thought, I didn't realize he was going as fast as he was, and so I, tried to make the turn. Well, I slammed on my brakes because he was coming much faster. He swerves, okay, it's happening right in front of Westminster. 1,000 kids, maybe 5,000 kids. I don't know, felt like 10,000 kids. Felt like every eye in the world was watching this, all right? So the guy swerves his car into the grass, jumps out, and loses it. I mean, loses it, okay? And this guy was clearly on steroids. Clearly, okay? Roid rage was happening in front of 15,000 students that go to Westminster Academy, all right? This guy's eyes looked like Satan, all right? He's about 25 years old, jumps out of the car, and my initial response was, man, sorry. That was not his initial response, okay? He was yelling, screaming, hopping, jumping, threatening. His face was red. He must have said the F word 100 times in front of the 20,000 students waiting to cross the street. Now, I roll my window down, okay? I'm at a disadvantage here. I'm sitting in my car, and Goliath is standing outside my car. Now, I don't care how big he was. I'm somewhat fearless, so I would have, if we weren't in front of Westminster, I would have, at least gotten 1 or 2 good shots in out the window. But anyway, so inside, I roll down the window, and I was like, dude, get back in your car, okay? What the beep are you gonna do about it? Blah, blah, blah. Going off. Who was there? Who was there? None of you were there? Thank God. Actually, thank God. That's unbelievable. Some of your children were, I can promise you that. So I said, get back in your car. What are you gonna do about it? Blah, blah, blah. I was cool, calm, collected. I was a cool cat, just sitting there, just taking it on the chin, just being self-controlled. Finally, security guard comes over and tells the guy to get back in his car and to get moving, and so the guy gets back in his car and gets moving. I pull in my spot. I look at half the football team who's standing there watching this. I was like, guys, come on. Where were you, okay? My gosh. Where were you? I could have used your help. No, we were coming. No, you were not coming. You were standing there, okay? So I come into my office and meet Steve, and we go across the street to the Westminster weight room, and students start coming in the weight room, and I'm being praised. Okay, wow, Pastor Tullian, you have amazing restraint. We saw the whole thing. You're unbelievably self-controlled. It was unbelievable. You did the right thing. You did the right thing. You did the right thing. Now, what they don't know, okay, is that while it appeared I was doing the right thing on the outside, staying cool, calm, collected, self-controlled, do it for the children, on the inside, I had a shotgun in this guy's mouth, all right? Literally. I was like, I swear if we weren't in front of the school, in front of the children, I would grab you by the neck, rip you through my window, and just pound on you for 5 minutes, okay? That was what was going on the inside, okay? But on the outside, it was just... Now, there were a couple of reasons why I kept my cool. Part of it was just self-protection. Not self-protection from this guy, self-protection regarding my reputation. Why did I not get out of the car and me and this guy just start fighting in the middle of 56th? Okay, well, I'm the pastor at the church. We're not supposed to fight in the middle of the street, okay? There's kids watching. It's not that I don't want to fight this guy. I'm dying to fight this guy. But there's kids watching. I'm the pastor. Pastors don't fight. They're not supposed to anyway, at least not in front of the church. If it's in a parking lot somewhere, Fine. No one can see, it's nighttime, fine, okay? Sticking up for your wife, your children, fine. But, not in front of the church and the school, lunchtime, 20,000 kids, whatever, okay? It's not. So part of it was just self-protection. It wasn't that I was so righteous and I was demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. I was just putting this on display. I told Steve when I got to the gym, I said, if I would have gotten out of the car and pounded this guy, I'd probably gained some street cred with some of the students. And he said, yeah, but you would have seriously lost pulpit cred. I said, yes. Yes, I would have. I'll give you that. I think that that's true. Okay, so what's the point of telling you that story? Even when we do what appears to be right on the outside, even though we do what appears to be the keeping of God's law, the demonstration of righteousness, if we're really honest and begin looking down deep in our heart and begin exploring our motivations for why we're doing whatever it seems to be good, what we discover is something less than perfect. Oftentimes what motivates us to do the right thing is self-protection, to protect myself, not sacrificial service to the other person, but self-protection. Not one time, not for a split second did I think to myself, this guy needs Jesus. That's not for 1 second. I was like, this is an evangelistic opportunity for me. If I can just calm him down, I can get him saved, Didn't even cross my mind at all, okay? I didn't even want the guy going to heaven, all right? That sounds terrible. Steve Brown was my mentor. He continues to be my pastor. He's known me since I was 6 years old. And he told a story one time about getting on an airplane when he was just finishing a speaking engagement. He had spoken like 3 or 4 times. He was worn out. It was nighttime. He gets on an airplane. And his only prayer getting on the plane was, God, I pray that no one talks to me because I'm tired. So, he sits down in his seat, guy comes and sits down next to him, and the guy, within 3 seconds, hey, I'm so-and-so, what's your name? And Steve's like, oh no, I don't want to have to talk all the way home. So finally the guy says, what do you do? And Steve said, this is a perfect way to get the guy to stop talking to me. He goes, I'm a preacher of the Bible, thinking that the guy wouldn't, the Bible? You believe that book? Seriously, that archaic book, come on, how can you believe those myths and legends? And the guy just started reeling into him. And Steve Brown said, listen, you're going to hell. And I'm asking you kindly, while we ride together home, if you would please go to hell more quietly, okay? So, anything unconventional that comes out of my mouth, blame him. He taught me, all right? But here I was appearing to do what was right on the outside, and on the inside, there was nothing good going on inside of me. Just put it that way. Nothing good at all. You see, if any kind of obedience, regardless of what motivates it, is what God is after, he would have showcased the Pharisees. And he would have said, follow their lead. Imitate them. Because no one kept God's law on the outside better than they did. So clearly the goal is not simply keeping God's law on the outside. So Jesus is now preaching this sermon and showing that to the people who think that they're pulling it off, to the people who are self-righteously believing that they're keeping God's commandments, that they're not. You see, they had been the Pharisees, and Jesus called them whitewashed tombs, clean on the outside, dead on the inside. They had been successful in achieving behavioristic righteousness and thought that that's what mattered most to God. And Jesus condemned them for it. That's so ironic to me, because that's kind of the way I grew up thinking Christianity, that's what I thought Christianity was all about, I thought it was all about behavioristic righteousness. That's the goal. And Jesus points out that the Pharisees had been successful in achieving behavioristic righteousness and thought, the Pharisees did, that that's what mattered most to God, just the way many of us who grew up in, Christian churches or homes or schools or whatever believed mattered most to God, and Jesus condemns them for it. See, Jesus shows that the law's demands extend to what goes on inside of us, our feelings, our motivation, not only external actions, but internal feelings. And motives must be absolutely pure and perfect. It's the demand. So, Jesus, for instance, in Matthew 5, condemns not only adultery, but lust. And he says, you think you're pulling it off because you haven't committed adultery. But I tell you, if you've ever had a lustful thought pass through your heart or mind, you are just as guilty before God as the adulterer. He condemns not only murder, but anger. You think you're pulling it off because you haven't killed anybody. Have you ever been angry for 1 second? Well, if you have been, then you're just as guilty before God. You are, in the eyes of God, a murderer. Jesus promises, Matthew 5, 21 to 30, he promises the same judgment for both adultery and lust, anger and murder, the same judgment. The horizontal consequences of those things are quite different, but before God, they're the same. See, this is what he meant in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, when he said, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. That's what he's talking about. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, the ones who are pulling it off on the outside, your righteousness, God requires a deeper righteousness than that. And unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You see, Jesus wants us to see that regardless of how well we think we're doing or how righteous we think we're becoming, when you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect becomes the standard, and not how much I've improved over the years, we realize that we're a lot worse off than we think we are. But typically, the way we measure ourselves, we look at the person next to us. We're desperately trying to find someone who's not doing as well as we are because that makes us feel better about ourselves. We do this all the time, inside our own homes. You know, we justify our bad behavior by saying, well, it's not as bad as yours. I can't believe you said that. Well, you said this. Well, you said it first. Well, okay, I said it first, but then you retaliated, but it doesn't matter. My retaliation's justified because you said it first. You drew first blood, Rambo. You drew first blood. We do this all the time. We attempt to justify ourselves by trying so hard to find someone that we are actually doing better than. This happens all the time. Siblings do this with one another. Spouses do this all the time. People in the workplace do this all the time. I feel better about myself when someone tells me a story about them that is far worse than anything I've ever said or done. This is kind of the way we measure ourselves. We evaluate ourselves based on how we think we're doing in comparison to how you're doing. We do this consciously, we do it unconsciously, and Jesus wants us to see that regardless of how well we think we're doing or how righteous we think we're becoming, when the standard is, you must be perfect as God is perfect. Okay, you must be perfect as God is perfect. He actually embodies and defines perfection. Okay, something is not perfect because, how do I say this? Never mind. I'll mess it up, so I'm not going to say it. So, if the standard is be perfect as God is perfect, that's the measuring stick. That's what Jesus is saying here. That's the measuring stick. Perfection. Not perfection how you define it, perfection how God defines it, which is bona fide perfection. When that becomes the standard and not how am I doing compared to this guy? How am I doing compared to him or her? How much have I improved over the years? Look at what I used to be and now look at what I am. Okay, I feel pretty good about myself. That's never the standard in the Bible. The standard is way higher than that. The bar is set to the level of perfection, not simply progress. And so it's only when our understanding of righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees and goes beyond outer conduct that we will see the impossibility of fulfilling the law's demands and the necessity of receiving Christ's righteousness. So our helplessness before the devastation of divine expectation creates the space for God's amazing grace and the freedom that it produces. We're going to walk through all 10 commandments, and I'm going to meticulously show you and me how we have broken every single one of them in some profound and sick ways. And then I'm going to show, as we make our way through every one of the 10 commandments, that Jesus has fulfilled each and every one on your behalf and on my behalf. That's what Jesus, that's the way we're supposed to read the 10 commandments. This is the way Jesus was pressing his audience to read the 10 commandments. Not just murder, anger, not just outside, inside, not just adultery, lust. I mean, he clearly wants us to be crushed, because it's only when we are crushed by God's demand for perfection that we can be cured by God's solution to the perfection problem that all of us face, namely Jesus. You see, Jesus says in Matthew 5, verse 17, that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Again, the law is not bad. It's good. It's too good, actually. Too good for people like you and me. He didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And this is evident in all the Gospels. Okay, so for example, we see Jesus go the extra mile with a cross on his back. Goes the extra mile. We see Jesus poor, meek, and persecuted as Roman soldiers beat him and mock him and spit on him. We see Jesus make peace as he reconciles God and sinners. We see Jesus turn the other cheek as he is repeatedly struck and scoffed at. We see Jesus love his enemies and pray for those who persecute him as he cries out from the cross they nailed him to, "Father, forgive them." In these passionate moments of Jesus, we see him fulfilling the law for people like you and me who are terrible at this stuff. We're just terrible at this stuff. So ultimately, God's law is a mirror that shows us who we really are, what we really need, and who Jesus really is for us. So let me just conclude with this. Imagine my friend RJ gave this illustration, and I think it's a very, very good one. Imagine there's this flash drive having every thought, word, and deed playing on the screen. Okay, imagine. The law must be fulfilled. But the law is not fulfilled by us. If we plug the flash drive back there into whatever you plug a flash drive into, and what appeared on the screens was your life from the moment you were born until right now. Every thought that crossed your mind, every feeling that went through your heart, everything you did or did not do, things you did when people were looking, things you did when people weren't looking, things you thought that you never actually said, things that you felt that you acted on or failed to act on, those sorts of things. If your life in all of its meticulous and messy detail was plugged in for everyone in this room to see, we would all know beyond a shadow of a doubt. No, number one, none of us would want to be around you, and none of you would want to be around me. Okay, you would be calling for my head, and I would be calling for your excommunication from the church. Okay, I mean, that's really, if our entire lives were put up on the screen. I mean, so you imagine there's this flash drive having every thought, word, and deed playing on the screen. The law must be fulfilled, but the law is not fulfilled by us. The flash drive of our lives would condemn us, crush us, devastate us, embarrass us, shame us. But Jesus fulfilled the law for us, and so when God plugs in our flash drive and plays what's on there, it's the perfect life-saving death and resurrection of Jesus. That's salvation. If you are in Christ, when the flash drive goes in, what plays is not your life. What plays is his life. What plays is not how you failed. What plays is how Jesus succeeded. What plays is not how you lost. What plays is how Jesus won. So when God looks at you because of Jesus, you and me are meek and mild. We are, because of Jesus, lovers of our enemies and makers of peace. That's what God sees. It's what theologians call imputed righteousness. What the great early church father Athanasius called the glorious exchange. He gets all of our law-breaking guilt and shame, and we get all of his law-keeping deposited into our account for free. And that's the account that God checks. That's the gospel. That's why Christian people call the gospel good news. I mean, it's good news. It's amazing news. It's the best news imaginable. You see, in Christ, we have a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Look real quick at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. This is it. I mean, this is it. This is the flash drive of Jesus being plugged in. And what's his is yours. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That is the righteousness that exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees. And it's not ours. It's Christ's righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. It's not yours, it's not mine, it's not ours, it's his. And that's what's given to us. So in God's loving eyes, because of Jesus, listen, we are perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. And so here's the mind-blowing, liberating good news that I hope and pray will help you walk out of here feeling lighter, dancing. In light of your shame, in light of your guilt, in light of how much you have failed, rest assured, before God, the righteousness of Christ is all we need. Before God, the righteousness of Christ is all we have. Let's pray together.